Welcome back to Crime, Corruption, Truth, and Theories. I'm very happy to have my guest with me today, George from cabdev.org. How you doing today, George?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
No problem. I've actually been looking forward to having you on for quite a while. I've listened to some of your work, and I have researched and looked over a lot of information on your website, cabdev.org. And we are mutual friends with the legend Thomas Myrtle.
Oh,
And
yes.
yeah, so but we're going to cover a bunch of different topics today. Before we get into the main topic of the Johnny Gosch case, I want to get your opinion on a case that I primarily cover on this channel, but I'm not limited to. I want to ask you a few questions. I'm sure you heard of the Jessica Chambers case, right?
Yeah, I have limited exposure based mostly on things you've told me before, but I definitely have looked into it.
Okay. One of the things I run into in this, not necessarily line of work because it's a hobby, but one of the things I run into, a problem that I run into is in some cases, some people to me, especially on Facebook, they're either anti-police or pro-police. And one thing about me is I always try to stay in the middle of everything. I try to look at every single thing in my life, no matter what it is, every case, everything. I try to look at it straight down the middle and keep an open mind about everything. In this particular case, I side with the investigators and the prosecutors. Quentin Tellis, and without going into great detail, Quentin Tellis, and I guess in particular, and after having conversations with Paul Rowlett, a data analyst in this case, the similarities in the cell phone data placing him in the vicinity of Jessica Chambers at the time of her murder and a girl named Mandy, a foreign exchange student in Monroe, Louisiana. I mean, the cell phone data places, for instance, in the Mandy case, places him 60 meters from her at the time of the death. He is literally caught with her debit card taking money from an ATM. And in the Jessica Chambers case, he at first admits that he seen her that morning, but then says he didn't see her the rest of the day. Well, once he was confronted with the cell phone data, he, his story completely changed. And he said he was with her all of those times throughout that day, except for like 30 minutes before she was murdered. All of a sudden, he wasn't with her. 30 minutes before she was murdered, they were sitting at his house, but he said that she left about an hour before she actually left. There was no he says she left at about 7 p.m. There was a camera right across the street from his house at a gas station. There was no vehicle that left out of that driveway at 7 p.m. But around 7:30, there was a car that pulled out of the driveway heading towards the crime scene. So I guess what I'm trying to say is in this particular case, all of the evidence points to Quentin Tellis. He is either the most unluckiest person in the world in both of these cases, or sometimes in special cases, circumstantial evidence has convicted a lot of people. Now, I'm not for ever convicting somebody that shouldn't be convicted. But in a case like this, with all of the evidence that's solely pointing to him, and I know there's a lot of conversation about, well, it could have been conducted by gangs because he is a vice lord. He's in Gangster's Disciples. What is your opinion on this case, just in general, with your limited exposure to the evidence? Me have watching both trials, I'm convinced if I was a juror sitting in those trials, I would have to vote that he is guilty. What's your opinion on this case?
Yeah, good, great question. I mean, definitely based on all of the circumstantial evidence that I've seen about him, he's a pretty damn strong suspect. Like you said, there comes a point when the incriminating appearances against you rise beyond the level of mere coincidence and get to the point of actually meaning something. You got to ask yourself at a certain point, could all of these things possibly line up against a person and they're still just innocent, that they're all tricks of fate? So I definitely do harbor a great suspicion in my mind that Quentin Tellis was somehow involved in Jessica's murder. As to whether he was necessarily the sole perpetrator, there are definitely, the realm of possibilities there. And like you said, the fact that he was part of the insane Vice Lord street gang, and there's actually some, the fact that the investigation into Jessica Chambers' murder ended up leading to a big FBI bust of a bunch of gangs within the subsequent year, and also combined with the fact that Jessica had been in contact with an author named Linda Oliver, trying to get her to write some story, the details
Right.
about which have never really come out, does certainly leave some suspicions that there could be more to it than just this one individual. But I think that the evidence pointing to him as somehow being involved and definitely not telling an accurate story about what he did that day and his contact with Jessica is very incriminating to my mind.
Absolutely. And here's one thing. We're not going to stay on this case too much longer, but here's one thing that I want to clear up, so to speak, to some of the people that I have conversations with in the Jessica Chambers Facebook group. Just because we say, well, look, a gang, this is could be gang activity or whatever. A lot of people, when they think of that, they think of like a bunch of people out there doing this to her. But in my line of work, in my personal life, I work around what's called in many instances at my place of employment, we hire work release. A lot of these people have committed small crimes. One person in particular, I would say he is a good example of the justice system working properly and doing what it's supposed to, which is rehabilitating people. He served 21 years in Angola for murder. He robbed a bank with his buddy. His buddy ratted him out. He killed his buddy. But I can attest to, he is a changed person ever since he got out. He does nothing wrong. He's been out for probably 10 years. He does nothing wrong. He goes to work. He goes home. He knows all about gangs. And if you serve 21 years in Angola as an African American man, you know a little bit about gangs. I mean, he was in gangs. He knows all about it. So I asked him, in general about this. I said, if a girl was snitching on drug activity or whatever, what have you, whatever the case is, and I said, and I told him specifically, I said, let's take the vice lords for instance. I said, if they wanted her dead, how would they go about doing that? And basically, what he said is the top leaders in that regional gang, let's just say vice lords, they're not going to get their hands dirty. They don't get their hands dirty. Low level members carry out things like that, is what he told me. So even if this was a hit, that doesn't mean that rules out Quentin Tellis. A lot of people, I believe, are under the impression that just because it may have been gang members, that doesn't mean that there were 6 or 7 guys over there doing this to her. If it was a hit, it could still have been carried out by this one individual, which could be why all of the evidence points to him. Now, there's a local gang leader of the Vice Lords that everybody wants to point to, and his name, I believe, is Boone Mister, a very bad dude. Quentin Tellis in his interrogation even said nobody messes with him, not even Quentin Tellis. So I just want to clear that up, that just because it could very well be gang activity, it doesn't mean that there's multiple perpetrators, but there could also mean that there is maybe one more person that was there. And furthermore, the father, Jessica Chambers' father, a lot of people want to insinuate that he was involved. Now, at first, I would say 100% chance no. But after watching a few documentaries about it, he does clearly say that he had a problem with her interracial relationships. I mean, this took place in a very small town in Mississippi, Cortland, Mississippi. So there are still some old timers, that uh, don't like their children being involved in interracial relationships and things like that. To go out on a limb and say that he had something to do with it, I think that's a bit of a stretch. However, that is a theory that's floated around out there a lot. So, a case that I can't wait to get to. Um, Thomas has told me, and you've told me a lot about many different cases. Y'all are always forthcoming and very knowledgeable on a very large amount of famous cases, and then a lot of cases that are not so famous. But the case I want to get to and let you educate us on a lot. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the documentary on Netflix, and I'm sure there's a lot of people we could reach out to that hasn't. But I have seen it, and it took my attention right off the bat, just pure interest. What can you tell us about the Johnny Gosch case? What do you think made this case so famous or infamous, however you want to call it, or however you want to categorize it? What do you think made this case so huge in the media?
Well, I think there were definitely a couple elements to it. Johnny Gosch, he was a 12-year-old paper boy living in West Des Moines, Iowa, and he was kidnapped on September 5th, 1982, and has never officially been seen since. He was indeed one of the very first, major missing children's cases, one of, if not the first kid to appear on a milk carton.
Right.
He also, his mother, Noreen, has been a very consistent advocate for Johnny and for other missing and kidnapped kids over the years. She led a big effort to change laws to make police departments act more swiftly, and has continually worked to keep her son's name in the news, and also investigated the case, dug up various leads, and made sure that the media spotlight stays on this. I think those are some of the big reasons why Johnny Gosch's case has remained so prominent over the years. And then, of course, there's also the fact that the case was ultimately linked to a much bigger alleged child trafficking operation going on, with a lot of political connections and much broader implications than just one missing kid, to the point where it seems that there's a giant nationwide network of people that are doing this to tons of kids around the country and arguably even around the world. And that especially is what sort of elevated this case from a tragedy that was localized into the heartland of America to something with substantial implications well beyond that.
Right. So essentially, I completely forgot about the fact that he was one of the first to be featured on the milk carton, which is historically significant. And then the mother um, pushing for all these different changes through the law enforcement departments, etc. But I guess you could say, in a way, I can't state this for a fact, but this case probably brought to light and exposed the realness and the reality of pedophile rings. Like, it's possible that before this case, a lot of these things were probably talked about, but not necessarily believed. This probably put it on the map, so to speak, in a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, it definitely was like that. And even, beyond just pedophile rings, the overall idea of children being in danger from, strangers was not a very well recognized concept. And going back into the 70s, when you had these various, famous serial killers like Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy, who were, abducting and murdering kids, that it was a very common response on the part of the police departments to think that these kids were simply runaways, that there was not really a recognition that nefarious individuals would be abducting children. And really, Johnny's case was certainly one of the first to change that perception through the advocacy of people like Noreen Gosch. It eventually became recognized that this was a major issue. And of course, looking into the issue, question of why would people do this to children eventually led into the realization that, once again, was sorely lacking in this country before people like Noreen really stepped up to the fact that there is an industry in this country that will abduct children for the purposes of, forcing them into the sex trade, forcing them to, be sexually abused by various individuals for, the profit of the people who are keeping them hostage. And human trafficking in general is one of these other things that's only, come into recognition very recently as a major issue. And this case was probably, at the forefront or very close to the forefront of making, starting a shift in the nationwide reckoning.
Right. And I talked about in one of my other videos, I wanted to look into statistics when it came to, well, how many kids are reported missing every year in the United States, or it might have been globally. I'm not sure at the moment. I think it might have been globally, or but regardless, whether it was in this country or globally, I was thinking that when I Googled it, I imagined it'd be a pretty high number, but I didn't expect to find that 8 million kids a year are abducted, or let me rephrase that, 8 million kids a year go missing. And a lot of these pedophile rings and sex trafficking, child trafficking, all of these things that are coming more and more to light these days really makes you stop and think, like you said, why is there such a market for these type of things? It's like, if there's that much of a demand for people in power, people with money, and all of these different things to have, I guess you'd just call it sexual relations with minors, in a lot of cases, like not even preteens or teens, like a lot of cases, 8, 9, 10 years old. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it makes you wonder, if you look at the statistics, if we knew the true statistics, I mean, you could literally be if you live in between two houses, one of those houses could have a pedophile in it. I mean, in all reality, it's actually quite sick. And then if you start looking at, I mean, I don't want to pick on the Catholic Church, because there's don't get me wrong, there's many churches and denominations that have had these types of things go on, but like the Catholic Church in general, all of the things that's came out about the Catholic Church with priests and altar boys and all of these different things, it's really mind-boggling. I really don't understand what the attraction is, what the deal is. And like, just same thing with Hollywood, a lot of actors and actresses that came out and talked about their experiences with this type of thing. And then most recently, the Jeffrey Epstein, which I probably shouldn't have got on, because you might be able to go off on that one for days, which actually would be would make for a really good video, probably a really good few videos. But it's mind-boggling to me to wrap my head around how there could be such a huge market for these types of things.
No, it really is insane to think about. That any normal person would be repulsed with the idea of, sexual contact with a child. You would think it's sick. So the fact that there seem to be so many people out there who enjoy it and are, have such a demand for it that they're actually, fueling a multi-billion-dollar child trafficking industry is, very difficult. A lot of people probably don't want to accept that this is the reality, but unfortunately it is. And with the numbers that you've pointed out, there's obviously no definitive, cataloging of, how many missing children,
Right.
are killed, by, lone predators with no connection to anyone else, how many are, killed by family members, how many actually return safely, and hopefully, many of them do. But certainly embedded within these numbers, you have a lot of kids who go missing and end up, either directly or indirectly somehow involved in the sex trade. It really is, tragic to contemplate. And Johnny Gosch, even the very notion of him being a victim of a sex trafficking ring is rather controversial in true crime circles. And if you want, we can sort of get into the specific details of the case and run through it and show why I personally believe it with basically no doubt that he was forced into a child trafficking ring.
Well,
But
no, absolutely. I would love for you to tell us about that.
yeah, sure. So Johnny Gosch, who I said lived in West Des Moines, Iowa. He was 12 years old. He was a paper boy employed by the Des Moines Register, the local newspaper. He had been employed that way for about 13 months. He had wanted to earn extra money so that he could get a dirt bike, or be able to fund various fun things in his life. And he had a very pronounced record as a responsible young man, never missed a day, was always on time with his paper deliveries, and even more broadly, he just had reputation around the neighborhood that just being a good kid. He would defend people from bullies. He was very generous, and everyone seemed to have a kind word to say about him. So he normally, when he would go around, he would wake up pretty early on Sunday mornings, go to a paper pickup location where the Des Moines Register Company would drop off bundles of papers, and then he would fold them, put them into his wagon, and then he would go through his little corner of the neighborhood where he was assigned to deliver his papers. And he did that, just as more or less as normal on the morning of Sunday, September 5th, 1982. Got his wagon and everything, just started walking to his paper pickup location, although there was one crucial difference in that normally his father would accompany him because it was early in the morning, not that many people around, and his family in general felt safer having him be accompanied. This time, Johnny ended up going alone on the route that morning. And as he was walking, just to understand the geography of the neighborhood, to paint a picture, there's a road that's running east. There's a road that's running east to west. That's called Ashworth Road, and cutting through that, going north to south, there's 42nd Street, and then another east-west road that's slightly north of Ashworth is Marcourt Lane. And so Johnny was walking east on Ashworth Road towards the intersection of Ashworth and 42nd, to where the papers were being dropped for the paper boys to pick up and start their deliveries. And as Johnny was walking to the paper pickup location, a blue car, drove up to him, was driving towards him on Ashworth Road, and then sort of, backed up and stopped right by where he was to say something to him. And, Johnny, spoke with him, but basically went on his way, and, went up to the corner, started getting his papers and folding them and everything. And the car, oddly enough, this blue car turned around, went back right to the corner at 42nd and Ashworth, where all of the paper boys were, unloading them and handling their deliveries. And this individual basically got out and started asking them for directions, all the boys for directions. He was described as a fairly heavy set, 5'9" Latino looking man with a mustache and every dark hair. And he was also, described as having, some sort of, manila envelope looking thing on this car seat next to him. They may have had some sort of papers or, some other, photos or other documents in it. And yeah, he approached these kids. He seemed very amped up in the early morning, and sort of gave off a very strange demeanor to a lot of the people. And Johnny even expressed some unease to the other paper boys who he was with at that corner. But anyway, this individual got in his car and drove away. But before he did so, he flicked the dome lights on and off 3 times in rapid succession and then drove off. And as he did that, another individual ended up stepping up. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. So basically, this person drove away as Johnny began walking down 42nd Street to take the paper that he just collected and start his deliveries on Marcourt Lane. And right before the person drove away and the blue car drove away, He flicked his dome lights 3 times, and at that moment, another individual came out of the shadows on 42nd Street and began tailing behind Johnny. This individual was described as a very tall man. Uh, so, he began following Johnny down 42nd Street. Johnny turned a corner from 42nd onto Marquardt Lane, and next couple of witnesses who were walking by, I guess walking up 42nd Street, passing Marquardt, for whatever reason, they saw Johnny slumped over on his wagon, but didn't necessarily think much of it. And then a witness who lived on Marquardt Lane named P.J. Smith. He was at his bedroom window looking out on Marquardt Lane, and he basically ended up hearing some sort of commotion or scuffle, and looked out of the window, saw that same blue car driving away. It basically drove out on Marquardt Lane towards 42nd Street, ran the stop sign, and then rapidly turned left, which would have taken it north on 42nd Street towards an interstate. So, and Johnny's wagon was just sitting there, right out on the street from the spot where the car had just driven by and taken off. Johnny was nowhere in sight. Papers had not been delivered, and Johnny had just vanished. And a little while later, various people in the neighborhood had begun calling the Gosches home and asking where their paper was because none of them had been delivered. And this was very shocking to the Gosches because Johnny had such a sterling record of, always delivering on time. This was very out of the ordinary.
Right.
And so Johnny's father went out and ended up finding the wagon and finding Johnny nowhere in sight. And, basically, so Johnny was, they realized their son was gone. So, they called the police. Noreen made a call to the police, and according to her and according to her husband at the time, the police took their sweet time. They waited 45 minutes before they even showed up, and when they finally did show up, they're basically started asking along a very unhelpful line, saying, had Johnny ever run away before? And Noreen, in the meantime, she, while waiting for the police, she tried to find out what was happening. So, called the paper and started asking questions, about who was at the papers out that morning, if they see anything. And she ended up collecting a lot of the witness accounts, of people, the paper boys, and also the father, one of the paper boys who had gone out to collect the papers in his son's place, a man named John Rossi. They'd all seen various things about what, parts of the story that I just related about what happened that morning. And so they already had a decent picture of something being up, that, this strange man in a car approached Johnny multiple times, and then this other man began following Johnny. So already you have a pretty clear set of indicators that this was not just some, Johnny didn't just vanish for no reason, that there was two strange men who appear to be coordinating their activities that were approaching Johnny that morning. And a car just happens to drive off right as Johnny, right by Johnny's wagon, and Johnny's nowhere to be found. It's rather painfully obvious to anyone who takes stock of the evidence that an abduction has taken place, although the West Des Moines police were very loath to admit it. And if you watch the documentary that you mentioned, it's called Who Took Johnny. I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but it was for a while. If not, I'm sure there are other streaming services that'll make it available. But yeah, it's a pretty good overview of this case. And they interview the police officers, and they're kind of shockingly defending their decision not to even consider this to necessarily be a crime. And even interviewed in like 2012, they're basically kind of hesitant to admit that it was an actual abduction. They're very much hedging on that. But it is very clear to anyone who looks at this that Johnny was kidnapped in a pretty well organized, well choreographed effort involving at least two different men.
Right. And
yeah.
I like well, one thing I'm thinking about is I totally agree with you that it was a coordinated effort. The one guy coming up and then flicking his dome lights, and then the other guy starts trailing him. It makes me wonder, especially, I don't think it's a coincidence, or I don't think it could be a coincidence necessarily that this happens on the day that the father wasn't there. I mean, it's probably possible that these guys might have been maybe looking around and scouting days or weeks prior to this happening. I mean, that's a heck of a coincidence that this happens on the day that the father isn't there. So I mean, it's possible that they could have been scouting this area for a while.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and you touch on actually a couple points that I will want to get into, but a bit later when the narrative develops further, because there's a lot. You've touched on a lot of important stuff. Uh,
Right.
in the meantime, going back to what happened in 1982, the police department seemed very unhelpful with this case, and Noreen, Johnny's mother, quickly realized that that was going to be how it went. So she ended up hiring various private investigators, and got them to do their own investigation. Canvassing the neighborhood, finding various bits of evidence, making sure they interview all the witnesses and get every single scrap of data they can find, and then also, of course, trying to keep aware of what was happening around the country. If Johnny turns up, if he gets cited anywhere, they wanted to be aware of it. So, the Gosches quickly realized that the police were not necessarily going to help them in this instance and started investigating it for themselves.
Right.
Now, about 6 months later, they got what seemed to be a pretty big break, which is in March of 1983, a boy who would appear to be about 13 years old in Oklahoma ran up to a woman, and asked her for help. It said, "Help me! I'm John David Gosch," and then got dragged away. And then this boy quickly got dragged away by two other men before this woman could even do anything. And she realized something was up, something was not okay with this. So she tried to report it to the local police. The local police, rather bizarrely, in my opinion, brushed it off as a family situation and didn't really seem to take it seriously. And so the woman was like, okay, fine, I guess police don't want anything to do with this. So she kind of kept this to herself for a while, didn't necessarily even realize the significance of it. And then later that year, a documentary on missing children came up on the TV. It was a documentary on Adam Walsh, who was a 6-year-old boy who had been kidnapped the year prior in 1981 down in Hollywood, Florida. And basically, while watching this documentary, it also pointed out other missing children, other missing and kidnapped children from around the same time period, and one of them was Johnny Gosch. And as soon as Johnny came up on the screen in that documentary, the woman realized, oh my God, I just saw Johnny Gosch, one of these missing kids. He was the one who I saw who tried to beg me for help and then got dragged away by these two men. So she made another report to the police, and this time it finally made its way over back to the FBI and then to the Gosh's investigators. And so both of them checked it out, and even the FBI pretty much concluded they believed it was Johnny Gosch. So already right there, 6 months later, you have a sighting of Johnny Gosch being alive and seemingly being held captive by two men. He was trying to escape from them, but yeah, they accosted him, dragged him off. So this already is interesting in that it seems to break the profile that a lot of people will associate with a child abductor. That a lot of people seem to have this perception in the true crime community that a child who's abducted is usually abducted by this lone predator who will try to sexually gratify themselves by raping this child, and then they'll murder the kid afterwards to get rid of the evidence and bury them, and that's it. That it's a quick crime, and that with this one person, and that's it. And in this case, the fact that Johnny was seen rather convincingly 6 months after his abduction makes it pretty clear that something else is going on. Why would a kid be kept alive for this long after his kidnapping unless he's being held for a purpose, very likely involving child trafficking?
Right.
And another fairly convincing sighting of similar value would turn up, not sighting per se, but a proof of life would turn up in 1985 when some people in Sioux City, Iowa, ended up receiving a dollar bill that basically said, "I'm alive, Johnny," and then was signed to Johnny Gosch. And this bill ended up making its way to the Gosches as well, who hired 3 handwriting experts and all of them verified that it was Johnny's handwriting. So now we're even a couple more years after his kidnapping, and once again, evidence that Johnny was still out there turns up. So why is Johnny, held for multiple years seemingly, there's a pretty obvious conclusion. And indeed, Noreen and her husband pretty much said at the time, that they believed that, Johnny was being held captive in a child trafficking scenario.
No,
So,
absolutely. And you've had conversations with her too, right?
yeah, I have talked to her a few times. There's actually an official Facebook group these days, the official Johnny Gosch group that Noreen is a member of. Various people will talk about the case, bring up facts, and she'll occasionally participate as well. Yeah, she's been a very tireless advocate for this, and in my opinion, deserves a massive amount of respect for everything she's done. No, not just for her son, but for the cause of children in general over these years.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure this case and many other cases have led.
Yeah. Uh, so anyway, sorry, you're still there. The audio might have just cut out for a second. Hey, are you still there? Hey, man, are you still there? Huh, okay. I don't know what happened. I guess his internet cut out or something. Well, share of issues. Hi, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I mean, I've seen instances where the guest ends up having their internet screw up and the host is the only one there. It's a somewhat unique situation to be the reverse, but
Yeah, well, my Wi-Fi for some reason switched to my house instead of my hotspot, so I don't know what was going on with that, but
okay. Well, yeah, glad you're back. I think you were saying something right before it cut out.
I'm not sure. Go ahead and continue. I'm gonna make sure that my connection's back right.
Okay, sure, yeah. So I mean, in the meantime, the investigation, the private investigation that Noreen and her, husband at the time were conducting, was carrying on. They get various tips around the country. They would check them out, and some of them were seemingly valuable. Others maybe not as much, but they cataloged and looked into everything they could. And having these sightings at least gave them some measure of hope that Johnny was out there. He was still alive for whatever, kept alive by these people for a sick reason, but at least he was still alive. Now, in the meantime, certain odd things were transpiring in to them over in West Des Moines. They got a lot of solicitations of people wanting to help them. Private investigators, for example, and one particularly bizarre instance of this was a man by the name of Sam Soda. He was a local PI in Des Moines, and he basically approached the Gosches, offered his services to investigate for them, and seemed to be offering help for a while. However, hey, are you there? Huh. I think he's gone again. Right. Yeah, let me just see if I can get in touch.
All right.
Hi.
All right.
Uh,
Maybe I got it fixed now. I don't know.
Hopefully,
I might have
yeah.
to. I might have to go back and edit that.
No worries if you have to. It wasn't too long anyway. But yeah. Getting, I guess, back to where I was, there was this individual, a PI in Des Moines named Sam Soda, who approached the Gosches, offered his services, and he seemed, initially may have seemed sincere. However, something kind of strange happened, according to Noreen, which is that in June of 1984, he called her to his office and basically gave her the information that there would be another paper boy abducted shortly, a bit later that year. They said it would be on the south side of Des Moines. It would be on the second weekend in August. That it would be another Des Moines Register paper boy, and so he just pretty much told this to Noreen out of nowhere, for whatever reason. And Noreen, according to her, she had even managed to tape him saying this, and tried to show this tape to the police, who didn't seem to care. Tried to take it to the media, who also didn't seem to really care at all about it. But anyway, come August of 1984, well, I think August 12th, 1984, exactly what Sam Soda predicted to Noreen came to pass. It was the second weekend in August, and another paper boy on the south side of Des Moines named Eugene Martin once again vanished while he was out delivering his papers early in the morning. And
Right.
once again, individuals saw him talking, saw him having been approached by was talking to this strange man that morning, in some sort of car that various descriptions were given of. So it was kind of a mirror image of what happened to Johnny Gosch, albeit with fewer witnesses than before to say anything definitive. But yeah, this PI somehow had managed to figure out exactly what was going to happen before it even happened, and this was pretty bizarre. Uh, so over time, Noreen and her husband they began to develop some suspicions about Sam Soda, about who is this person? Why does he seem to know so much? You know, is there some sort of darker aspect to this? And in the meantime, Sam Soda was engaging in some pretty weird activities of his own. He I guess most notably, he started right around the time of Eugene Martin's kidnapping, forging a name for himself as a as an advocate against pedophilia, against child abductions and child exploitation. He formed this group called Stolen Children uh, are reported every day, or scared was the acronym. And this was his group, his supposed advocacy group, where he would hold these conferences around Des Moines, where these seminars where he would teach people about the dangers of this stuff, of child abductions and the like. And while on the one hand he seemed to be fulfilling a very decent purpose, on the other hand there were some bizarre aspects of it, in that he was actually holding conferences where he would literally show audiences child pornography, whole audiences of spectators, even including police officers, who would go to these conferences and be blasted with these images of child porn that Sam Soda had gotten his hands on.
That's
So
crazy.
I know it's just beyond the pale, and it got to the point even weirder. People did report him about this, and the first assistant attorney in Polk County, which is where Des Moines is, Ron Wheeler, had even sort of gotten in touch with Sam, and by Sam Soda's own account, he this Ron Wheeler pulled him aside and basically said, I should prosecute you for this, but I should tell you to stop doing this because it's illegal, but instead I'm going to give you my blessing to keep showing these images, which is also pretty weird. So Sam was able to keep showing these images. He never faced any charges. No one seemed to investigate where he even got this child pornography from in the first place. So yeah, and who is this? Why does he seem to live this charmed life where no one does anything to him? And how did he get these images? what is Sam Soda involved in? As time goes on, a pretty weird picture about this man emerges. And another sort of weird thing indicating the level of connections that he might have to the sort of underworld in Des Moines is a strange expose that he did in October of 1984. There was, in October of 1984, a man named Frank Sikora, who was a sort of a supervisor, an adult paper carrier for the Des Moines Register, was outed as a pedophile who molested a number of boys who worked for the Register. And Frank Sikora was arrested for this, brought in, and charged with child abuse. And he had initially been revealed by Sam Soda, who somehow tracked down this pedophile who worked at the Register, even though no one had been talking about him, no one had reported him to police or anything. Somehow Sam found this guy, was able to tape a confession from him, despite being an ordinary citizen with no law enforcement authority, and then was able to out them to the authorities, who sort of did their own corroborating investigation and found victims who would talk and nab this guy. So at the time, Sam Soda was sort of saying, hey, maybe this person has something to do with Johnny Gosch's abduction, although there was never any evidence to that effect that ever developed. And also very much buried in a lot of the news accounts and not really talked about since then. Sam Soda also had, alluded at when the Sikora case initially broke, that there was some sort of larger network of people in the Des Moines Register, that it wasn't just Frank Sikora who was doing this to children, that there were others who he networked with. The names of other people in this network never came up, and the talk of a network was entirely forgotten. And Sam Soda certainly never talked about it since then. In any appearances he did, he is now deceased as of, I think he was deceased as of this year, or it was very recent that he ended up passing away. He did make one public appearance on a podcast in 2018 that I might get to a bit later. But yeah, Sam Soda never talked about this again. So how are they able to dig out this individual at the Des Moines Register who was a pedophile who was abusing a number of the paper boys? Why did he talk about this larger group that then never talked about it again? So just in general, this individual, Sam Soda, there was so much weirdness surrounding him, why he seemed to be so well connected, so well protected, never went down for any of the questionable things he did, seemed to have access to child pornography, seemed to know about underground networks of child abuse in Des Moines. Just a very weird, and was able to know about Eugene Martin's kidnapping before it happened. He was such an odd character in so many ways, and understandably, the Gosches eventually got suspicious. And I guess one other thing I should touch on, he undoubtedly had organized crime connections. According to both Gosches, he actually was at one point, able to try to get an organized crime contact of his, associated with the Chicago mob, to go to his sources and see if they knew anything about Johnny Gosch. So Sam was definitely linked to organized crime circles as well. But anyway, yeah, the Gosches did eventually become suspicious about him and started, trying to get him investigated. And I believe according to Noreen, he was even put under police scrutiny at one point. And as this began to happen, the Gosches themselves received harassment and threats from around Des Moines. And both Noreen and her husband at the time talk about this in a documentary called America's MIA Children, which you can find if you look it up on YouTube. They talk about how, right when they started, really drilling deep into some, suspects, which, was seemingly alluding to Sam, although they didn't name him at the time. They started, getting, people would call them, make harassing phone calls. They would find, people would throw rocks at their house. They would find their porch light, which they'd always kept on as sort of a commemorative thing. This idea, until Johnny comes home, they're going to keep their porch light because they always wanted the door to be open for their son if he ever came back. People would literally, unscrew their porch light. They would, call these people, and then they'd be harassed right after. So they were facing a lot of sudden, intimidation tactics right at the time that they began putting, twisting the screws on some of these suspicious people. And it eventually got to the point where Noreen and her husband, once again, both tell the story together in this documentary, that she had gotten a solicitation to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma for some sort of lead that they were going to get information on. And then Noreen also, and then at the same time, received some inside intel from a sort of underground source that Noreen should not go there because a contract had been put out on her life. And so the police
Hmm.
actually got together and sort of set up a sting operation where they sent someone in place of Noreen to go to Tulsa in place of this guy, and they found out that it was found out that it was a scam and arrested him. And definitely, luckily nothing further transpired. But based on all the sources and the weird way it went down, it has appeared that there was some sort of threat that may have nearly come to fruition against Noreen Gosch. And so ultimately, there was a lot of very pronounced weirdness going on in and around Des Moines as the Gosches stepped up their investigation, and they had this local individual named Sam Soda under suspicion for involvement in the case. But once again, it never really got further than that. They didn't really have a way to connect the dots to really get a narrative of what happened in the crime. But
Right.
in 1990, that finally changed when an individual named Paul Bonassi in Nebraska came forward. And he told a story about a pedophile ring in Nebraska with nationwide connections that he had been involved in, and basically said that as part of this pedophile ring, he was asked to, he was made to help kidnap Johnny Gosch into this same network.
Really?
Yeah. And this is a case that some people may be familiar with. If you looked at the Johnny Gosch abduction, you probably are familiar with this, that there was a network known as the Franklin Scandal, based out of Omaha, Nebraska, that reportedly involved a lot of prominent people, both in the city of Omaha and also just around the country in general. The Franklin Network was centered around one man by the name of Lawrence E. King, or just Larry King. He was the proprietor of a local credit union that was meant to serve Omaha's black community, but he had taken over the credit union in the early 70s and pretty much started turning it into a big financial fraud scheme. That he was embezzling money from it to fund a lavish lifestyle, and pretty much and gotten to the point of eventually got to the point when it was finally closed down in 1988, when the federal regulators finally, after constantly sort of being put off by Larry King's political connections that he had developed at that point, eventually raided the credit union, found that even though this credit union was not supposed to be a big financial bonanza, given that it was serving the relatively poor black community of Omaha, somehow he had stolen about $39 million from it. So there was a big financial ripoff that had happened with this man named Larry King, and he was before that point living a very implausibly, wealthy lifestyle that he should not have been able to make legitimately. And so people around town had noticed there was something off with him for a while. But beyond that, there was a much darker sort of underbelly to it, which were, rumors were flying for a while that he was involved in the exploitation of children, that he was involved in drug trafficking, that he was involved in all sorts of nefarious underground organized crime activities. And, various solid allegations surfaced throughout the 1980s to this effect from various kids who really had nothing to do with each other. If they did know each other, only knew each other through this network in the first place. And so many different independent mentions of Franklin came out. There was a girl named Ulysses Washington who had been in foster care lived in the foster home of a couple named Jared and Barbara Webb, who were actually relatives of Larry King. And Ulysses Washington and all of her foster siblings had been horrifically abused at the hands of the Webbs, both physically and, in Ulysses' case, sexually, by Jared Webb. And as she began, and eventually they were able to get out of the home, get into a new foster family. And as she became more comfortable with her new foster family, she began, telling the full extent of her story, both that she had been sexually abused by Jared, and also eventually that the Webbs had taken her to their relative Larry King, and that Larry King had been involved in essentially prostituting them out throughout Omaha and taking them on trips elsewhere, all over the country to sexually service other men who Larry King would bring them to. They named some pretty high up people, even named, even named the vice president of the United States at the time, which is very controversial. But Larry King undoubtedly was connected at these high circles of political power. He was a fastest black rising star in the Republican Party. He certainly had connections to people like Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He, was very known as a big fundraiser. Had a prominent role in the RNC, and also in Omaha, he was very well acquainted with a lot of the powerful people there and in the state of Nebraska. So he had all this sort of political juice, and the allegations started to come out with it. He was actually prostituting children out to some of his powerful friends, so that they could have sex. Basically, would sexually assault these children.
Right.
And after Ulysses Washington came forward, there was another girl named Shanetta Moore who was in a youth care facility for various, personal, problems of hers, like drug addiction and the like. And she made very similar overlapping disclosure that she had been involved in a child prostitution, child pornography ring, and eventually disclosed that Larry King was a ringleader. Talked about how she had been sexually abused, and even some of these people were so awful that they would actually murder these children. That it was sick stuff. And so Larry King's name came up twice in the context of this. At the same time, there's another weird instance where in 1980, I think it was also in 1988, where this teenage girl at a supermarket was approached by this weird man, this photographer named Rusty Nelson, who wanted to use her for modeling photographs and took her to his apartment. This girl was accompanied by her mother just to be safe, and it started out normal and enough, and then eventually Rusty Nelson sort of began getting her to take off more and more clothing and strip down, take very risque photos, and then eventually said he wanted to take naked photos of her, this teenage girl. So they had this apparent child pornography photographer named Rusty Nelson who was saying, "Oh yeah, my boss keeps this place stocked," and it turns out that the apartment that he was subletting, in which he had his photography studio where he was taking these photographs, the person who subletted it to him was none other than Larry King. So once again, you got this photographer Rusty Nelson who is taking child pornography photos, and his boss in whatever he's doing is Larry King. So already you have these three separate instances of Larry King showing up in connection with the abuse of children. Solid, witnesses coming forward saying this stuff. And then this was all before the credit union collapsed. And when it does collapse, and finally gets seized in November of 1988, a special committee of the Nebraska legislature was formed to investigate this stuff. And they initially began investigating it for financial fraud, but some of them were aware of the rumors that have been floating out about Larry King's involvement in child exploitation, and so they had broadened their focus to not just concentrate on the financial crimes, but also the child exploitation. And this investigating committee, they hired a investigator to start looking at this stuff. Eventually, that investigator quit in the sort of controversial blow-up this committee had, and they hired another investigator named Gary Caridori, who is very well respected in Nebraska, PI and law enforcement circles. And so Caridori began, pursuing this case very strongly, gathering all sorts of leads about this Franklin network. And eventually he was able to find a number of witnesses who told various stories about being abused at the hands of Larry King and his pedophile network. One of the first, really the first major victim he came across was the name of Alicia Owen, a girl who talked about being enmeshed in this network from a very young age. She had been introduced to it by a student at a guy named Jeff Hubble at the local Catholic orphanage Boys Town. And Boys Town had come up before in some of the accounts of these children, saying that they knew some of the other kids alongside them who were being abused and taken to these sadistic pedophile sex parties were students from Boys Town, this very well renowned Catholic orphanage that took in boys who had nowhere else to go, was widely lauded as this making their lives much better, but instead seemed to be doing exactly the opposite in a number of cases. So Alicia Owen talked about how this Boys Town student had recruited her into the network, that she had been essentially been enticed into sort of, was groomed very subtly. And at the first party, she was just exposed to what was going on, wasn't really forced into anything. The next time, she was basically, she was raped, according to her, by the police chief of Omaha, Robert Wadman. And over the years after that, she talked about being, raped, by many of these other men, prominent people in Omaha, taken by Larry King on trips around the country to other individuals who, similarly wanted to abuse children. And from Alicia Owen, she told them about, her friend and sometime lover, Troy Bonner, who was another victim of this network. And, Troy Bonner gave his account, and then Troy Bonner led them to Danny King, another victim. And so all these people began giving accounts to Gary Caridori, and then Gary Caridori managed to dig up in 1990 another victim named Paul Benassi, who Paul Benassi had a very tragic childhood that he, was basically being exploited nearly as long as he'd been alive by various pedophiles in Omaha, and eventually got into this network as well, and had had a lot of experiences and encounters with many of these men in Omaha and elsewhere in the country. And so all these people, were giving these accounts, but unfortunately, the case was quickly swept under the rug. A grand jury investigation was impaneled and supposedly was trying to get to the truth of Franklin, but what was really happening was that, and that, this is all this is well documented in the book, in the book called The Franklin Scandal by Nick Bryant, who's a journalist who did a fantastic job reporting on this case, and I think everyone should check it out. It's a very solid, well documented work showing that this case was very real. There's no, sensationalism, no conspiracy theorizing, to use that as a pejorative as many people do. This is solid fact-based stuff. And
Right. No,
unfortunately,
I'm definitely gonna check it out myself, but keep going.
yeah, so this grand jury, which was convened, basically, tried to break down and discredit the story as much as possible. And shortly before the grand jury was impaneled, the FBI began getting into this case, and they were purportedly investigating it. But what really happened was that the FBI, they got to Troy Bonner, they got to Danny King, and they pretty much said, you need to recant what you said. If you don't recant the story, we're going to prosecute you for perjury. So they pretty much intimidated these two boys who were victims of Franklin into taking back their stories and claiming they made it all up. And they similarly propositioned Alicia Owen and Paul Benassi to get them to recant their stories, but they were not willing to. But in any case, the FBI managed to turn Troy Bonner, Danny King, and turn them into, basically they would tell the story that that this was all made up, that this was a hoax that Alicia Owen had drawn them into, and essentially try to say that, yeah, we were just gonna make a sensational story, and we were gonna try to sue everyone and collect on the money or whatever. And it so ultimately the grand jury is impaneled, and they pretty much they mostly call witnesses with the intention of trying to discredit the story. They call in Troy Bonner and Danny King to say that to get them to talk about this supposed hoax. They will call in Paul Benassi to more or less and Alicia Owen more or less just to discredit them, break down their testimony. They call in Gary Caridori, and they try to insinuate that he is involved in some sort of unsavory activity of trying to shop Franklin as a Hollywood story to get money off of it, which is another ludicrous and borderline libelous claim. But ultimately, the grand jury is just trying to get a narrative that this case was false, that the people who came forward as victims made it all up. And Gary Caridori even got to the point of realizing that he needed to get solid proof of this, and so he began working his sources, trying to find photographic evidence that would prove that these sex parties took place. According to numerous sources in Nick Bryant's book, he finally made contact with Rusty Nelson, who at that point had moved out of state and was hiding out in Chicago. He flew over to Chicago to meet Rusty Nelson, got these photographs, and basically called up people like the head of the Franklin Investigative Committee and said, we got them by the short hairs. There's proof of this. They're not going to get out of it. And he flew back from Chicago in his private plane, and then his private plane blew up in midair. He and his son who were with him, they died. The photos were never found. And
The private plane blew up in midair.
Yeah, I mean it's very bizarre, and it was ultimately passed off by the National Transportation Safety Bureau as an accident. But the actual facts of the case suggest something much different. The wreckage was strewn over a pretty substantial radius, and this would not have been likely to happen if the plane had just crashed normally. It even admitted the plane broke apart in midair. So something very bizarre happened to Gary Caridori on the way back, and there were even witness accounts to this effect saying that there was a big flash of light in midair. So what although it can't be definitively proven what happened, the timing is very convenient. The fact that these Gary Caridori is just coming back with a solid proof of this, according to multiple people who he spoke to right as he was doing that. And yeah, he just fortunately he died, and the whatever evidence he got perished with him. And then right after that point, the grand jury handed down their indictments and all in their report, their associated report that talked about all of gave their own conclusions about Franklin. And they said, yeah, this whole thing was a hoax. It was all spun out of control by a bunch of rumor mongers, and basically, it pretty much attacked everyone who had anything to do with this case. Anyone who tried to elevate the voices of these children and get their stories heard, it basically tore into them. And but in addition to that, both Alicia Owen and Paul Benassi were indicted on perjury charges. So for coming forward, for telling about their abuse, they were called liars, and they were literally charged for the crime of telling their abuse by being branded as liars who supposedly lied under oath. And so Alicia Owen was put on trial for this. And if you read Nick Bryant's book, his account of the trial, it is the most absurd sort of kangaroo court scenario you'll ever hear about. Alicia Owen, even though she was the one on trial for perjury, you could argue that all the witnesses against her should have been the ones on trial for perjury, because pretty much all of the stuff that was used against her by the state was massively, blatantly false. That, for example, Troy Bonner and Danny King were both put on the stand to testify against her about how the hoax had supposedly developed. Their stories were notoriously inconsistent. They would contradict their grand jury testimony. They would say things about their lives that were proven false by school records and travel records and such. They would, and most egregiously, the supposed nature of how the hoax developed was totally false. It was claimed that Alicia Owen had made a phone call to Troy Bonner to tell him about the idea for the hoax, but the investigators actually got the phone records and found that this supposed phone call literally never happened. And similarly, Troy Bonner supposedly met with Danny King and gave him the whole hoax story afterwards, and imported in his mind. And supposedly this meeting happened at the bar at a local hotel called the Residence Inn, except the hotel actually didn't even have a bar. So once again, this is a story that just has no basis in reality. It's just totally made up, and yet the state is putting on these witnesses who are testifying to this and saying all this stuff to try and inculpate Alicia Owen in this hoax. And similarly, they put on this one of the people, a local judge named Theodore Carlson, who Alicia Owen had accused of molesting her. He tried to give himself an alibi on one particular day when the abuse had taken place by saying, "Oh, I was watching a football game the whole time." But his story was also inconsistent. That 3 individuals testified against him. That he tried to claim that he had arrived super early, much earlier than he actually did, to the point where the testimony of these people would have given a time window for Alicia Owen to have been molested, but he was trying to testify, "Oh no, I got here much earlier than that, so she must have been lying." And another one of the people who she implicated, who was the police chief Robert Wadman, testified basically. He tried to say various things like, "Oh, she said I carried a gun, but I've never carried a gun since my days as a federal agent in the 1970s." And then Alicia Owen's defense lawyer, introduced a deposition of him in 1980, where he was in Utah as a public safety commissioner. He said, and he admitted to having a gun in his waistband. So he was also, trying to lie and say that he, tried to discredit her story, but he ended up just, telling something that was totally not true and was provably not true. So there, just the whole way this case transpired is just insane. And Alicia Owen, unfortunately, was convicted of perjury, even though the whole case against her was a mess. And the supposed smoking gun evidence against her, which is a letter, between a rather unsavory character named Michael Casey and her, where the hoax supposedly began. This letter was contained this letter was dated March 15th, 1990, but it was in a pile of material seized from her cell on March 8th, 1990. So how the hell did this letter from 7 days after it was seized get into this material? It's just, there's so much about this case that smells awful. There's, the fact that Alicia Owen, who was a victim, got charged and convicted of perjury is insane. And the case was swept under the rug in a, amazingly disgraceful way. But yeah, this other individual, Paul Bonacci, was also charged with perjury, but then just after Alicia Owen was just barely convicted of perjury. Initially, some of the jurors were considering acquitting her after she just barely got convicted in a absurd, trial with so much misconduct that should have overturned her conviction. The state dropped its charges against Paul Bonacci. Clearly, they were not confident that they could go 2 for 2, and so they just decided to let Alicia stand as a message for anyone who would come forward that this is what would happen to you. But yeah, that's the Franklin case in a nutshell. And Paul Bonacci, he came forward to in 1990, and he shortly after the grand jury had finished its work and handed down its indictments, and he had basically said, he ended up relating to his lawyer that he was involved in an incident with a paper boy in Iowa, and then his lawyer checked it out and gave him some checked some information with him, and then his lawyer John DeCamp realized that this matches up with a case that is pretty famous and pretty well known in the Midwest, the case of Johnny Gosch. And so he contacted the Gosches and pretty much said, I don't know if what he's saying is true, but I have a client who's confessing to involvement in the Johnny Gosch abduction, and you need to come down and listen to this. And so that's how Paul Bonacci first came forward, and how he became enmeshed in this case and became the very first witness to link it to a pedophile network. And that that really is how the case really finally, Johnny Gosch's case, finally got some real momentum for the first time in nearly 10 years.
Right. Well, I mean, it's definitely an interesting case. I mean, it's very widespread. It's uh sex trafficking and the network and the ties to the mob and the power, the money, the power structure and the RNC and really just politics in general, both sides of the aisle. I mean, I'm sure there's players from all different sorts of backgrounds and higher ups that are involved in these type of things. And we're definitely gonna have to come back to this. Like this will kind of be like a part one, so to speak, of the Johnny Gosch case because there's no way you'll be able to cover it all in one day. And as I already knew, but now everybody else would be able to tell that you're very knowledgeable in a lot of these cases. And another case that I want eventually, not today, but another case that I'm sure has a lot of parallels to the Johnny Gosch case is the Jonbenet Ramsey case. One day I would really love to get you on to talk about that case as well. And before we go, I want to bring up a case that I've been recently informed about. And maybe one day when you get time, I know you're busy. We all are, with work and life. But uh, it's, they have a group on Facebook. It's called Justice for Brandon, and his name is Brandon Emery. His mother is constantly she puts videos on Facebook, TikTok daily, and she's constantly laying out the facts in this case. The police tried to say it was a self-inflicted, and the autopsy said that he died from complications with pneumonia. But one thing I want to talk about real quick, just to lay the groundwork for this, is I'm just going to read a little bit of this. It says, "For no signs of foul play, Asheboro police continue to investigate the death of a local man. According to Captain Richard Thompson, on September 12, 2019, officers responded to an apartment located at 711 South Church Street, Asheboro, around 3:20 p.m. We responded out there initially for a welfare check, Thompson said. When we got there, the apartment was secure. There were no signs of forced entry. Officers made entry to the apartment and found Brandon Wesley Embry, 33, unresponsive on the floor, running water from the bathtub in the apartment, which was in a state of disarray. The mother says that the apartment was completely just torn apart. Um, the water from the bathtub had overflowed. Emery was lying naked on in a small pool of water, though he was still breathing. Emery had multiple visible injuries, including bruises, cuts, blood was found all around the apartment. There was blood splatter on the ceiling, etc. Stuff like that. Said it was locked up. No obvious signs of what we would think of a struggle. Emery was taken to Randolph Health and transported to Moses Memorial Hospital, where he later passed away. His body was sent to the office of the chief medical examiner in Raleigh for an autopsy to be conducted. Those autopsy results revealed he died from complications with pneumonia. What happened when he laid there in the water in the temperature dropped dramatically. So, without getting into great detail about this case, the mother has laid out tons and tons and tons of information. She's kind of like in a lot of these cases where the police don't really look into it like they should, and the mother's family members have to either hire people or look into these things themselves. She's acquired tons of informations and screenshots, text messages, but there's some women that he was messing with around this time. I mean, his body had bruises and cuts. He was beaten, scratch marks all over him. I mean, this case, I would like to talk about one day for sure and dig a little deeper into. Maybe have have his mother on to talk about it. But the police essentially are saying that he did this to himself. And if you just, I mean, like the mother was saying in one of the videos I watched, I mean, just the blood splatter alone in the various locations, it would indicate that it'd be impossible for him to do it to himself. And
Right.
you know, it to me, it's a very interesting case, and hopefully one day, if you have time, you can look into it. And I've been looking into it a little bit, and hopefully we can use this case as something to talk about in the future too. But Thomas told me you were really uh, very, very in depth with the Jonbenet Ramsey case, and that's one that's always before I even started doing videos on any cases and true crime at all. That's one that's always fascinated me from the get go, and really the whole world. I mean that's just such a famous case and a tragic case of a beautiful little girl, and then come to find out that you know, there could be a pedophile slash pedophile ring uh tied to that case as well. So
Yeah.
hopefully one day in the future I can get you back on and we will discuss more on the Johnny Gosch case and more start maybe discuss some of this Brandon Emery case and Jonbenet Ramsey case. But I want to thank you for coming on today and really laying out, I mean, just tons of information. You can't even, it would take the information that you laid out today in this video would take somebody that don't know anything about it probably years to acquire, sit down and really acquire all of that information. So, I mean, that's exactly why we invited you on, and I really appreciate having you. So,
Well, thank you. And I mean, it did honestly take years to acquire, my website, cavdef.org, which I do want to point out, when I say a lot of stuff on these live shows, there can be a inclination, and I think it's a healthy one for people to wonder why you should necessarily believe anything that I say. And I think you shouldn't believe anything I say. Go to my website, cavdef.org, navigate to the wiki section, And you can find pages on stuff like Johnny Gosch and pretty much any other case that I've looked into, and you can find all the sources for yourself. The Johnny Gosch article in particular is very heavily footnoted with a lot of information, and you can track it all down yourself. It's sort of a project that's gone on over the years. I'll find a little bit of evidence that here or there, and add it to the page, and eventually, as you do this, a picture begins to form. And
Right.
that really is the way that I worked. And Thomas, of course, has been at my side helping me through a lot of this. He's sort of a esteemed colleague in all of this. But yeah, a lot of these cases, it's sort of my opinion that the reality of what happened, that it is out there. The truth is out there, so to speak. But you have to be patient. You have to dig. You have to put together a lot of things that may not seem connected at first, but as you put them together, you start to see the way the different pieces of evidence fit together, and you can eventually find out a lot about a case that way. And that's what I've been doing at Capita for a while. The investigation that I do, digging through news articles, digging up public records, interviewing people, and it's what I imagine I'll be doing well into the future, trying to piece together the truth of all of these tragedies that occur.
Well, I can tell you that I appreciate it, and I know a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people are interested in true crime and a bunch of different cases. And I'm gonna tell you that anybody that doesn't produce videos or doesn't do research and they just like to tune in to listen, and I imagine we're gonna garner a lot more support in the future on this channel. Um, it takes a lot of work to do what you do. I mean, a lot of times I'm sitting there just trying to find out one little piece of information about a case, and it takes me forever. So it's not easy to do what y'all do, and it 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 really makes for great information and discussion when we're able to talk about these things at the level that's researched by y'all. So, uh, like I said, thank you for coming on, and if anybody might have watched this, if you have any comments or questions that you would like to ask George or myself, any cases maybe you would like to bring to our attention, please do leave a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, think about subscribing. There's going to be a lot more content in the future. And that's going to be it for today.